hours, or 7.5 to 8 hours. So
I have like almost non-10, like
yeah, is rough. So one of the interesting things, the last time I taught this class, they got brought up, just as an aside before this, someone wrote a paper about the nature of time and subjective time and the experience of time in space, or the space civilization, specifically Mars. Mars has a different length day. So how do you address that time difference in human circadian rhythm? What effects is that going to have on just the way that we live? And then socially, what do you do with it as well? Because it's not, you can't neatly divide it the way that we can with 24 hours, because it's like 24 hours and I want to say 25 minutes, something like that. Something along those lines. So it was one of the more interesting papers, because I didn't even consider like that social construct of time and all this. That's just a fun, like, aside thing. I think I might have mentioned it in the book, but it's neither here nor there. So we have, that's a blue one, I don't think. We have one real big, we got 3 days of class left, right? I don't know where else. We got 3 days of coursework left, and the next Wednesday, you're going to present your research findings. I'm going to crank through your detailed outlines like Saturday morning. I've got to be down here for Kernel Day, so I'm going to come down a little bit early, be ready for that. I'll probably crank through them then. I believe in y'all. So that's where I'm at with that. I'm believing in y'all. And if my belief has been misplaced, we'll deal with that a little bit later. But this week, well, really for the last 3 sections, last 3 meetings of this class, kind of sad. Really enjoyed this class. I hope we all feel like you've gotten some value out of it. We're going to be dealing with, and continuing to dealing with, the idea of politics. And this is a newer conception than I've probably given y'all in any of the classes you've taken with me before. It's the 3-faced version of politics, the 3-fold version of politics. And we're going to touch on all 3 over the course of the next 3 class meetings. The first is the idea of gaining power. Right. That is, when we talk about politics, like as non-political scientists, when you engage with people and talk about politics, what are you talking about? What do they care about? The non-nerd version of this, or the politics nerds. When they say they're a politics nerd, but they're not actually a political science major, what do they care about when they're talking about politics? Like elections and like the horse race and the stuff that it doesn't matter. Hopefully you've taken enough political science at this point that you realize that, like, yeah, okay, cool, but it doesn't really affect the show. Hopefully we picked that up somewhere along the way. I know some of y'all are approaching graduation. Hopefully y'all can. You want to graduate this semester? Madeline, I think, is graduating. So that's the first one. We are going to talk about that, but we're mostly going to talk about that in the guise of what the institutions themselves actually look like, and then what the ideological fights that we can see about Mars are going to be, right? Just off the top of my head, the workers versus the settlers. Scott was graduating. So the workers versus the settlers, or the idea of how much terraforming do you want to do, right? The whole like red Mars versus green Mars sort of deal. So that's the first conception of politics. The second conception of politics is one of the ones that hopefully are a little bit more, you've been more interested in. I'm more of a 2 and 3 politics guy myself. The second level of politics is governance. Right? Actually wielding power and using the institutions to achieve goals. And the third conception is relationships between sovereign entities, or international politics. So these are the three conceptions of politics we're going to be dealing with really for the next three classes. Right? So I'm going to try to deal boom, 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 each one of these along the way. Although we're really going to start, because we already started, with number 2, right? How the institutions themselves can be crafted, right? So this is where we're going. This is what we're going to be wrapping up with. This is the political science payoff at the end of this class. We've been really considering all of the wider social realms. Maybe next time I teach this class, I'll teach it as like the HUMA course, but whatever. Or maybe liberal. I don't know if there's a liberal arts designation. Anyway, when we left off last class, I realized that it never went live. So I didn't actually have a recording of what we did, which is unfortunate. But I believe we left off talking about the different functions of a state, the different things that a state needs in order to actually function. Let's see how far I can read the layers and layers of writing. Okay, so goals. Legislature makes laws, executive enforces laws. Oh, I think we already touched on we left off with judiciaries, right? Talking about different functions, different ways you can craft the judiciary. So, leg, exec, judicial. Part of bureaucracy, or part of executive, that really bears thinking on is the idea of a bureaucracy, right? In the Constitution that y'all have been drafting, which, remember, that's going to be due as a whole entity next Wednesday. Make sure you have that thing ready to go. Not this one, but the next one. Right? You ended up crafting a presidential regime. But even in a presidential regime, parliamentary regime, whatever way that you put things together, when it comes down to the executive, they really can't make a system function on their own. Right? Every executive branch is going to be tied in some way with the bureaucracy. These are the people that make laws and regulations that actually function within society. Now, I remember y'all were talking about in your legislative process, creating legislation and building a legislature in the direction of much more clarity in their laws, right? It's where the laws actually tell you how, right? They're more closer to regulations, right? Was that what y'all were working on? Am I remembering that properly? Everyone's looking ahead. Okay. That must have been your Valley book. Okay. Either that or you have good notes. But there still needs to be someone to put the laws actually into practice, right? A single executive, a president, is too small of a person, right? There's just not enough reach to be able to do the things that a government needs to do. And while this makes my inner Ron Swanson scream in anguish, there does need to be some level of bureaucracy to help a government accomplish the goals that it needs to do. Even if you're trying to build the leanest government as possible, there's going to be some degree of bureaucracy, right? These are the people that are actually boots on the ground enacting policy. You got to find some way to build up an institution that can do this. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can go about building a bureaucracy. Right? The first big decision that you need to make is, do you want it to be professional or political? So professionalized bureaucracy are career civil servants, right? They are people that this is their job. They're going to get into it and do this forever and ever. Amen. Right? They're the ones that really hold institutional memory. For an example about the benefits of a professional bureaucracy. Whenever you need to navigate the policies and procedures that this university has unto you, who do you go speak to? You go to your advisor first, right? And then where does your advisor tell you to go? Because they don't know.
The head of the department.
Even they typically don't know. We send you to the administrative assistant, our professional bureaucrat. We have been gifted with one of the best, intelligent, capable administrative assistants. She is leaving to go take a better position. Oh my God, help us out, please. Lillian has been fantastic. We're going to miss her greatly. Congratulations on moving on to bigger and better things. She is the guardian of institutional memory. There are things that I do not know. When I need to navigate our framework, our bureaucracy here, I try to find a capable bureaucrat. Whenever you need to deal with the bureaucracy, right, there are people out there that are professional navigators of the bureaucracy, right? If your grandparents have ever wanted to sign up for Medicare, Social Security, get all that stuff done, right? There are literally people that just do that for a living, right? Help you do that. So professional bureaucracy is capable of knowing and understanding what works, what doesn't work, how the process actually functions. You can't tell I'm more of a fan of the professional side of this bureaucracy. But there are also arguments to be made about having a political bureaucracy. The thing about a political bureaucrat, right, these are typically appointed. Is that it's easier to get rid of them, it's easier to replace them, and they're typically people that believe in the not the process, but the goals, right? Your professional side is going to be much more about process. Your political side is going to be more about goals. If we were to look at this in the context of, say, American politics, we have both a professional bureaucracy and a political bureaucracy. Right? The professionalized bureaucracy are the people that really make the system work. You can almost think of them as, right, I like to think of it as like a Viking longship, right, of the state. They're the ones that are rowing the boat. And then the political person, the appointed person at the top, is the one that steers the vessel, right, shows which way it should go. But what happens when the political person makes a stupid decision? What happens if the captain wants to row you towards the shore? They can correct the ship as well by working together, right? That institutional memory can actually really help inform political appointees as they come and go. Right? There's a nice balance to be had there between these two things. So that's your first one. Do you want a professional bureaucracy? Do you want a political bureaucracy? How do you want to divvy up the roles of bureaucracy? The second big choice, beyond just professional and political, is who are they going to be responsible to? Right? Who actually oversees and directs the bureaucracy? Who gets to pick the bureaucrats? Who gets to oversee the bureaucratic process? Typically, this goes one of two ways. It can be the legislature, which in our system is technically how it works, but they get driven and are underneath the guise of the executive. So somewhere like the United Kingdom, their bureaucracy is a very professionalized force that doesn't even really respond to the prime minister. The prime minister only appoints the ministers. And then the bureaucracy underneath that is actually much more responsible to the legislature itself in many ways. It has a high level of independence. So the bureaucracy can also be very independent, or it can be very much reliant on the executive or the legislature to work. Sorry you're late. Fighting with OBS for another presentation since 2 a.m. Yikes. I feel that. Sometimes you gotta fight over yes. It is what it is. Okay. Just delineating those out for you again. So these are the 3, or really 2.5 big decisions to make about how you form your bureaucracy. I mean, you can theoretically attach your bureaucracy to a judiciary. You can make it much more heavily independent, but right, really it's going to come down to tying it either to the legislature or the executive, figuring out how that power relationship is going to work, because your bureaucrats are going to be your main force for enacting the policies that the rest of the government crafts. Right? They are the sword that is being wielded in this second conception of politics. They are the ones doing the governance, largely speaking. Thoughts? Well, what would you choose? Right? How did y'all choose, or did y'all not really address bureaucracy within the guise of the Constitution? Right? If you look at our Constitution, it's not really in there either. In fact, in most places, bureaucracy just kind of forms along with government because it's too difficult for an executive to function on their own, but it's at least worth thinking about. So what did y'all end up with on this? What do y'all think about this? What would you do? If you were God Emperor of Mars, how would you enact your iron will on humanity?
So I was over in legislature, so we split it up. So I think we saw the libraries for the workers, and then settlers were split up like that. Just to kind of separate it, I would want a settler to be, eventually, I would say the settler house would kind of consume the worker house after it kind of grows.
Or maybe the worker house changes into like
something else.
because we talked kind of about turning it into an assembly, right? An assembly of different sub-polities, right? Almost more like a lawns rocks along the way, but right. So making the settler, right, the House of Settlers, the driving feature, like the lower house, more responsible for running the bureaucracy. Right? But I did think that y'all did say that the president had the ability to select his own cabinet, so American style. So basically modeling off the American style as opposed to the British style.
I know I just had it earlier that each house could put their own make their own subcommittees to kind of help better manage each what they have to do.
Yeah, so it's the oversight function, right? Which our Congress here doesn't do super well, but there is right in many ways. The form looks good if you can find ways to reinforce it. And I think that's what y'all are trying to do is to tweak the problems of the American presidential system to make it function a little bit more, giving more power, actually returning it more towards the way it was in the initial conception of the legislature more power. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that's pretty functional. I personally prefer my bureaucracy more like that, like more in the American model, with just a little bit better oversight from the legislature as opposed to the executive just getting to say how it works. So, cool. So beyond a bureaucracy, there's a couple of other elements that really matter in crafting a state. Ooh. Jesus. Look at that. I think I might go grab the spray after class and do a little work in here. So we've got a legislature, executive, and judiciary. We have a bureaucracy. What else do you need to make a state function? I know I listed a bunch of stuff out. about last time we met. But I've got three more big features that are necessary to make a state work. So the next one I want to talk about, actually kicking us back a little bit further, are banking institutions, right? How you set up a financial system, right? A system of exchange. So first I want to talk about how you set it up, and then I want to dig a little bit deeper into the things that it's actually going to do. This is different than what we've talked about previously when we did political economics, in so much as we focus more on the economy side. This is going to be more about regulating and building markets. So I'm going to get into that a bit. And even if you decided to turn Mars into a communist workers' paradise, like they still have to have banking in a system of exchange in some way, shape, or form. Even Star Trek, once they've got the just like magic that creates the food for them, they even still have some sort of banking monetary exchange system. So, important. The first choice you have to make is, do you want to set up an independent or a dependent banking system? Right, this is typically the biggest decision that the government can influence within a state, right? And there's really strong arguments both ways, right? And we're actually going to set this up as a matrix with the other big axis of choices to make, which is central or decentralized. So you can almost conceive of it like this. You can have an independent central bank, you can have a dependent central bank, you can have an independent decentralized system, but you cannot have a dependent decentralized system, just because there's nothing to really heavily grab a hold of. So let's talk pros and cons of each different thing, and then try to move a little bit further. So an independent banking system, right, is separate from politics. That's not to say that the government or politics can't influence an independent banking system, but what that means is that once the people are chosen to run the system, they get to run it on their own. Typically the way that these independent banking systems are set up is there's like a board of directors, leaders of that bank that are political appointees, but then once they're in those jobs, the government can't tell them what to do. Right? Or at least they don't have to rely on what the government tells them to do. They can do their own thing. In the United States, we have an independent, centralized banking system. Right? So there is one big bank to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. Now, there's a ton of banks in the United States, but they all get their money from one source, right? If something goes wrong, they can appeal to the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Bank, and get bailed out by them. So in the United States, we have this independent central bank. What is it? It's the Fed. And they can do all sorts of stuff about controlling the supply of money, right? That's what they're really in charge of, regulating the flow of currency. And they do this primarily through interest rates. They need to print money or make money expensive to borrow or cheap to borrow. And we're not even going to touch on inflation stuff here. That's somewhere else. But this is what an independent central bank would look like, right? All of the other banks that are established are essentially driven through market activity, through market actions to do what that bank wants. And that bank gets to decide how the economy should flow, right? Which levers on the economy to turn, what dials to move up and down. Typically, do they want to have higher interest rates or lower interest rates? That's really what they do. So that's one way of building a banking system is similar to the United States, independent, centralized banking. We kind of get how that works. We more or less understand that independent, centralized thing. The Federal Reserve is a complicated beast, right? It's often called the creature from Jekyll Island. They literally created on Jekyll Island off of Georgia, and like it is a intricate creature at this point. But it is able to set interest rates, which basically controls the way the larger economy functions. We're going this more or less, yeah.
So it's separate from politics, but it changes because of the politics going on.
Yeah, I mean, they can respond to what's going on in the larger world, but they have more freedom to do it because they don't have to really face election, right? They don't face election. They are able to respond to the world, but the president can't tell them, hey, you need to lower interest rates, because that's what presidents can always do, right? Because you want money, right? You would want money to be cheap so that it's flowing freely, which causes the economy to grow, right? Because you want to get reelected. They take away that electoral incentive so they can do what is necessary. Interest rates are going to go up a lot in the next couple of years. So just know that that's coming. If you don't already have a locked-in credit card thing or don't already have locked-in loan rates, like, do it now, because I think we're probably going to see 25% interest rates, like when my parents were young, soon, for like a house. So like credit card interest rates for houses, we're going to start seeing that. Thank God I've got 2.75% on my mortgage, because Jesus. I apologize, it's going to be very difficult for y'all to buy houses. I'm so sorry. It was already going to be tough, and then now interest rates are going to be a bitch. So, but that's going to be necessary to fight the inflation, and that's the only way to do it. The only way to fight inflation is to raise interest rates really high. So this is going to cause a recession. Just know that's coming. Be prepared to graduate into a recession. It sucks, I'm sorry. If you're looking to go to grad school, let me know. I will write you all letters. All right. Another way of setting things up is like the UK. The Bank of England is a dependent centralized bank. The leader of the Bank of England is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? He is actually a member of the government and enacts the policies of that government. That is the perfect response gift for rising interest rates, Madeline. In case you don't see it, it's a screaming goat. It's beautiful. So the way that a dependent centralized bank would work is very similar in the centralized capacity, meaning they can raise and lower interest rates, but it's very politically driven, right? So it is much more responsive to the overall political situation, right? Meaning that there are incentives to keep the government in power so that they can continue to do those policies, so they can enact the monetary and fiscal policies of the political party that's in charge, right? So it's much more heavily political, right, in a direct way, because while our chairman of the Federal Reserve doesn't have to face election, the leader of the Bank of England does. Well, technically it's not the leader of the Bank of England because of the Queen, but You get what I mean, right? Now follow me? Good so far. Okay. An independent, decentralized bank or banking system. What does an independent, decentralized banking and monetary system look like? Well, it's not that they do what they do.
Like corporate almost?
The best model I can think of to put this forward, right, to help this make sense, because I think this is really probably the purest example of it, is Bitcoin. Who controls Bitcoin? It's just the ledger. And it's independent. Who sets the value of the coin, right, of that monetary system? The people participating, right? So it is both independent, meaning that the government cannot influence it, and it's decentralized because there's no one central place that you could leverage to change positions. For the record, I am not a crypt bro. I think I have like a tenth of an Ethereum somewhere that I don't even know how to access it. But like, I have some Ripple. I made a couple $100 off of Ripple one time. But I don't think that crypto, right? It's not a money making scheme. It shouldn't be a money making scheme. It's meant to be a separate financial system on its own. And the pure speculation part's just like speculating on the value of money, which is dumb, but whatever. So a independent, decentralized banking system is one that you cannot regulate. You just set up a system and it runs itself. In many ways, this could also be like the various banks in the Confederacy, right during that 5-year period when the Confederacy existed. They had a decentralized, independent banking system. The United States has gone through several periods of independent, decentralized banks where the banks themselves literally print their own notes, and it's based on, right, how widely those notes are accepted. Maybe company script, I think that was kind of what you're getting at. It is a deregulated system with not deregulated, that's the wrong word. It is a system where there's no one place that you can actually leverage what's going on. So I think crypto is probably the best way to conceive of that. I actually know a guy that has created a Mars coin. He runs Mars coin. And the idea there is that you could actually create an independent, decentralized banking system for Mars predicated on blockchain technology. I'm not 100% sold, but I'm not also not sold. Now I'm looking at it, I can see one other way that you could actually get to a dependent, decentralized currency. And this is a government-controlled blockchain. Right? So the government actually issues the coin and then allows the system to function. I don't know if it would actually be 100% decentralized if the government is issuing the coins, but there's at least maybe something there. Graduating 2 times, the interest being so high. I am so very sorry, Matt. So very sorry. Okay. So maybe there could be a dependent, decentralized system, but I'm not 100% convinced that can actually exist. So of the 3 big options, not thinking about dependent, decentralized right now, which of these systems would best serve the goals of a Martian economy? A political economy, right? The politics that you would want there. What do y'all think? And don't get me wrong, I know this one's like super duper in the weeds, like This is beyond. This is beyond graduate political economics at this point. Right? So let's try to I don't know, see what y'all think.
I'd probably say independent just because on Mars I can just clearly see the government could go crazy rogue or dictatorship, whichever route that I wouldn't want it to be dependent and centralized. So I guess I would say independent.
So at least the independent side of it, whether or not you want it to be centralized, that probably centralized. The one counterpoint I want to bring up to that, just to get it out there, the project of developing Mars, a Martian economy, is probably going to require some sort of nodal agency, right? We did nodal agencies, right? Like we were talking the developments, right? It's the central thing that coordinates politics and economics to work towards the goal. And I don't know if this is actually the banking system itself or if this is something outside of it. It's probably actually something that needs to be outside of it. So in some ways it needs to be a way for the political system or this nodal agency to discipline the banking system as well, to make it work towards whatever the larger goal is, developing Mars and whatever, however far we want to take that. So, I think independent centralized or independent decentralized are probably the better ways to go. Because in many ways you want it to be independent from the politics so that they can keep the plan on track. The law, right? Although, I say that out loud and keeping the plan on track, that's how things go sideways. So, something worth thinking about at least. It's worth at least keeping it on the board. So beyond just simply setting monetary policy, right, the value of money, the banking system is also going to be responsible. Credit, lending, capital creation and management. People are going to need money. They're going to need a way to raise more money and bring money together to accomplish goals, right? It's going to be really hard for an individual once they get to Mars to actually do bigger things. And what do you do when you actually get there? How do you continue to build a livelihood for yourself? You're probably going to need credit and lending, and this is especially going to be relevant with the idea of the land shares that y'all brought in. Right, everybody gets a share. Everybody gets a plot of land. You can pull those together. Or you can leverage the share that you're going to have to convert into something else, right? That's going to fall under the banking system, right? That's going to create a new asset class. And then you also get the question of, at what point do you stop issuing new land shares? What kind of built-in things is that going to have down the road? That's hundreds of years down the road, but eventually you're going to get a large enough population on Mars where you can't give off parcels anymore. So then how does that change the system? Or is that that's one that we know it's a political problem down the road, but we don't have to deal with it. That's 500 years down the road's problem, right? There's at some point you can just punt on a question and know that they're going to be able to deal with it better later on down the way. Maybe they subdivide bigger. But that kind of gets us to another question, what are the political problems we want to see? We'll talk more of that next class. So just building an economic, banking, currency, financial system is going to be a big problem that isn't inherently within a constitution, but is a constitutional element of making a state function. Right? Look at that distinction. It might not be something you would put in the Constitution. I'm sure y'all didn't touch this, right? I mean, in the United States, they didn't touch it. Britain, they haven't touched it. Very few places actually build this into their Constitution, but it is very hard to run a state unless you actually have these features. Okay? States can't do what they want to do. They have no capacity if they don't have these mechanisms for controlling capital and labor, managing their assets. So there's going to be a big set of choices to make, but it doesn't inherently have to be a constitutional thing. Well, in the Constitution.
Wasn't this where, like, when they were starting the United States and starting to expand, wasn't this about that in a lot of rebellions?
Yeah, right. So, in the very earliest stages, right, during the Articles of Confederation period, right, the United States of America part, there was not a central bank, right? And there was no independent central bank that existed. There was no bank in the United States. And the currency that they used, right, that continental dollar, had undergone both inflation as well as the government itself had taken on more debt than their GDP. Something on the order of 150% debt to GDP ratio was where they were operating. So when you have that much debt overhang, when the government owes that much money to people, and the reason why they owed money is because they had to pay for a war, and they didn't have European backers, so they had to just literally print more of that money to be able to do it. When it came time, right, to pay those debts, and they couldn't really do it, that's when you got those rebellions, right? Shays' Rebellion was all about, where's my money? And even if he'd gotten his money, that money wouldn't have been worth anything. The Whiskey Rebellion was an attempt to try and deal with that by raising a tax, and well, don't tax the whiskey, we just thought more about that. So that, right, is that kind of what you're getting to, right? If you don't have these things ironed out, or you have a good system that functions, you're going to run into a lot of crises. And it's not necessarily a crisis of just the entire economic system collapses. That didn't happen. It's a crisis of the state can't act because they can't do the things that they would normally do. They can't take on more debt. And eventually you get to a point where no one's going to lend you more money, or you're spending all of the money that you do take in, or a large percent of the money you do take in to service your debt. Right? It's like if you get a really big credit card bill, you let that credit card bill, that balance you owe, rack up, and all you do is you make those minimum payments paying off the interest. You're never going to pay that down, right? And all of your money, right, as that keeps compounding, is just going to keep going to paying that interest. And it's going to make it really, really hard to actually do the things you want to do. So how did they fix it? Right? How did the founders fix that problem? Well, they scrapped the political institution they had and created a new one. And the key thing they did at the same time is they created a new, not the one we have now, they created an independent centralized banking system, and they changed their currency. Keep that one in the back of your pocket because we're probably going to see that one happen within the next 20 years or so. So that's going to be fun too. That answer your question, or did I just go on like a?
Because as soon as we were talking about Alexander Hamilton popped into my head, I'm like,
yeah.
This is what he had.
That's exactly what he was attempting to do. His big idea was to create an independent, centralized bank, take on all of the debts that the states had, and the part that they don't do in the musical is that he got rid of the continental dollar, replaced it with the U.S. dollar. He had to do it, right? They had to do it, but they didn't get into that, right? That's the part where, like, we get into it and we're like, oh, that's what he actually did. That's what happened in the room where it happened, is they decided to kill the currency that they were using. Can't wait for that to come through in June. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it is coming to New Orleans in June. It's very good. It's worth seeing. Even if you're not into musicals.
I saw it on Disney Plus.
Oh, right, they put it on Disney Plus.
I feel like, I don't know that, I mean, obviously in person's always better, but I don't know if the cast can like equal up to the original cast.
So the guy that played Washington when I saw it was better than the original cast. And some of the original cast are still in the touring company because they closed on Broadway and New York's still weird, but they're touring around now. All right, so we've got legislature, executive, judiciary, bureaucracy. I'm going to get the spray here about banking. What was that alert?
ESPN.
Well, I know it's ESPN, it's going down.
This is mock draft.
Oh, okay.
Should be a mock draft.
Oh.
What?
Yeah. All right. So legislative, executive, judiciary, bureaucracy, banking. Now, the last two we're going to talk about theoretically fall under bureaucracy, but I think are worth dealing with on their own merits because they don't inherently have to, right? They're often treated as separate parts to bureaucracy. These are the apparatuses of force and suasion. All right, so on the one hand, you have policing. This is internally focused. Right? Policing structures are all about the provision of justice, right? They're the ones who use force to provide justice. So they're kind of at a nexus between the bureaucracy and the judiciary. You need something to ultimately enforce the rules that you put into place, right? And that ultimate guarantor, the thing that makes states work, is their monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. They're the only ones that can legitimately do it, right? And they use that threat to back up everything else that they do, right? What happens to you if someone steals your stuff? What happens? And they get caught. They get caught, they stole your stuff. What does the state do? Put them in jail, and right, that gets us back to our provision of justice stuff we did a couple weeks ago, right? Put them in jail. What happens if you murder someone and the state catches you and says you're the actual one that did it? Jail or
Jail.
Right? That's right. That's the ultimate threat here. What happens if you don't pay your taxes?
Jail.
Well, jail, or they just take all of your stuff, right? All of the things that the government is doing are ultimately predicated on the fact that they will use force to accomplish the goals that they want. Right? Now, what happens if that force structure breaks down either internally or externally?
Justice isn't gonna happen.
Justice doesn't happen. The state can't do what it wants to do. It all falls apart, right? It loses capacity and it just doesn't fall apart. So let's focus on the internal side first. When it comes to policing, there's a couple of different decisions that can be made. Do you want to have a unified policing force? Or do you want to have Decentralized policing. It's the United States versus the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has one police force. They're all the same cops, right? If you've ever seen Hot Fuzz, right? The big, brash Simon Pegg guy, really good cop in London, was so good at being a cop, they kicked him out to the middle of nowhere. And they can do that because it's all one police force. Right? They can redistribute them, right? You're probably thinking, well, why the hell did you get kicked out of London and be forced to go work in the town? Don't have to watch that scene, right? On the other hand, in the United States, we have very distributed policing, right? How many different policing entities exists? Overlapping jurisdictions where we're standing right now.
Probably like 3 or 4.
So, Nichols PD.
Cool.
I mean, they are technically real cops, guys. They're technically real cops.
Okay. I actually the games that are right while we're actually have tasers and saying a lot of tasers. I'm like,
They don't have tasers, but they've got Glocks. I'm just saying. They are more than mall cops. So, Nichols PD, Thibodeau PD, LeFou Sheriffs, Louisiana State Police, and there are certain crimes that you could do where the FBI could get involved. And I guess, theoretically, Interpol could play a role if you're doing like a real big international crime in Thibodeau, Louisiana. And all right, so technically, right, just aside, this is like 3 levels deep. Interpol doesn't have actual cops. They're more like liaisons between national cops. Interpol can't arrest you. They have to have a national cop arrest you. Interpol doesn't have a jail. And you can only be under Interpol's jurisdiction if your police in that nationality have signed on with the treaty. So, international law is weird. So do you want to have it unified or decentralized? There are benefits and drawbacks to both, right? Unified policing means that you can have all of your information in one place. There's just one entity there. Decentralized means you probably have local people and local knowledge and right, local variations in laws. Right? How politically tied do you want your police force to be? What sorts of, right? The police, right? Would you rather deal with a British cop or a Russian cop? Because in Britain, they are a much more professionalized force. They are much less politically oriented, whereas a Russian cop is at the whim of whatever Putin wants him to do. Just letting you know, British cops are the best. Love British cops. It's like the only police that I'm like, oh, they all great. Swiss cops are all right. They're a little stern, but they're all right as well. But how tied into the political system do you want them to be? What role do you want them to play in providing justice? Right? It's kind of the ultimate question there. And then, right, you can kind of get into questions of surveillance over the people, secret police, that whole deal, but that's going down a real dark path. Probably always exists, but we're not going to deal with that too heavily. Any other thoughts about policing? Criminal justice? I can never remember what's your major?
Mass comm.
Mass comm. I can never remember that. Sorry, my bad. This is my bad.
It's irrelevant in this class.
History, political science. Madeline's history and political science.
I'm a political science minor.
All right, so I know y'all are late in your career, but and how much time do you have left?
one semester.
Probably not enough time to do it, but if you catch it early enough, you can perfectly stack political science and history on top of each other because they're overlapping like courses, match up, and if you get a political science degree, you can get a free history major, or if you get a history major, you can get a free political science major if you take your courses right. It can perfectly match, but you have to catch it early. So I tell all of my advisees about that like day one, if they're history inclined. And Dr. Wilson's starting to realize it as well. So. Okay, Nichols. All right, the other side of this coin, right? This is the internal side. The external side is about dealing with other sovereign entities. And we're going to come back to this more heavily next week, but I just want to talk about the setup for foreign policy. Right? You can break this down into two sides: diplomacy, or soft power, and military, or hard power. They do very different things. Diplomacy, all about persuasion. Military, kills people and breaks things. These are two vastly different spheres, and we're real bad at remembering that they're two different things. Right? We were especially bad at that over the last 20 years. We seem to have maybe just a little bit remembered it. No. Right? And there are different ways of setting up this apparatus, right? How do you want your diplomacy and your military to relate to each other? As well as how do you want them to relate back to the other branches of government? So diplomatically, okay. So diplomatically, who do you want to be in charge of doing diplomacy? Who is it supposed to be responsible to? Do you want the executive to be able to go off and do this on their own and make deals for everyone? Or do you want there to be some sort of legislatively selected diplomats that are responsible to the diplomats? How independent do you want your diplomats to be? Because on the one hand, you want them to have freedom. But on the other hand, you want them to deliver the goals of the state itself, right? Of the people of the state. Typically, both diplomacy and military fall under the head of state role. And whether or not they are under a single, right, the same person, or if you break up your head of state, they're still going to be under that function. But there's a decent argument to be made that the people that are good at doing diplomacy are different than the people that are good at doing military. Two different ways of thinking, right? So you might want them to be responsible to different areas with the head of state, with something directing their activity. So that's one really important thing to think about there, is how do you want your diplomacy to function? And then I just started reading a really interesting book. Right? The first option, negotiate. The second option, well, not negotiate. We'll come back to that. But there's a third option, isn't there? Clandestine activity. It's more than diplomacy. It's more than persuasion, but it's not quite military power. Right? This is black operations. This is intelligence. This is an important part of the world, the way that the world works, that we often don't neatly consider when we're doing foreign policy. Can you go in the American foreign policy class this semester? You don't talk about the third option at all? Or is it all diplomacy and military?
We talked about it a little bit, like just kind of more like World War II and then Cold War stuff. Not really much past that. We kind of just talked about the creation of it, because I mean, half of it we don't really know.
Yeah, there's a bunch of, and that's part of the problem, is that they like to do secret squirrel stuff. They like to keep it.
Yeah.
It's a game, but it's an important game, and sometimes it actually works, right? It influences the larger world. And I've just started reading this book, and it's an account of how the United States has used this third option since like the 1880s.
Is that like a red phone that's in the president's office?
No, it's right? The red phone is very much option one, soft power, diplomacy, like they call each other up and talk to each other to prevent hard power. But the clandestine stuff is the stuff that you do that you don't really acknowledge that you did it. Assassination of foreign leaders, creating terrorist groups, training terrorist groups, fomenting revolutions. The stuff that's like, spies, intelligence gathering. It is right. It is a world that we don't touch on really much when we talk about foreign policy, but it's very much there. I don't know how effective it truly is, and I don't know if we can know, but it's something that's always on the table. We just don't talk about it. And they don't. They like that we don't talk about it. And then you get into questions of oversight. Who knows what's going on here? Like we're just gonna put a big black box with a question mark in it, which is I'm sure exactly how they want it. So the other side of this coin, acknowledging that this is doesn't exist, right? Is the military, the hard power solutions, right? This is the ultimate guarantor of sovereignty. Right? This is what protects the state itself from external actors. Right? Thanks, Russia. I don't have to make this point all that hard anymore because we now see this in action every day on Twitter. Not so much on the news, they haven't covered it super well. But if you're hooked in on Twitter, you're seeing it pretty often. If you don't have a good military game, it can be very difficult to maintain your own sovereignty and to do the things you need to do, right? To protect your own people. None of the rest of this stuff matters if someone comes in and takes it from you, right? So you have to build up a military system that can guarantee protection from external threats, right? Now, you hope that you can solve things through diplomacy, through persuasion, or maybe through some other stuff. But at the end of the day, if someone wants to come and take Mars for their own ownership, you've got to have a way to defend it. So how do you build a structure and a system that can do this? Do you want it to be independent or political? Do you want it in civilian control? Or military control? Right. How do you want to set up the branches? Meaning, what activities do you want to undertake? How does it get funded? Who makes decisions about what actually gets funded? Right? There is more into crafting a military than just do we want to have one and how do we get money for it? Right? What things do they want to buy? So the independent versus the political, I think that's really important to say, right? An independent military is more concerned about protecting the state as it exists and the citizens, right? It is this ideology and this culture that the military is meant to be a guardian against everything else. Whereas a political military is going to be much more closely tied to ideology. So, examples here, right? On the one hand, you get our military, which for all of its faults, for all of its downsides, for all of its upsides, is an independent military. And if ever there was a moment for the military to step in and be political, I think we've seen a couple of those in the not so distant past. They didn't do it. They remained independent. they stayed out of the politics. Because the first time you do a coup, then coups happen. On the other hand, militaries can actually be inherently tied to the politics themselves, right? The military of China is not the Chinese military. It's the People's Liberation Army. It is part of the political party. Or, in a more nefarious way, the military of Russia, while ostensibly an independent unit, functions essentially as an oligopoly under Putin, right? They literally give money to generals to do things. And right, if you want to have it under civilian control versus military control, right, that determines where the money's going to go and how the administration is done. Civilian control, right, there's more oversight in where money flows. If it's under military control, then you just give a whole bunch of money to military, like generals, and then they buy the stuff that they need. And we've seen how well that works in Russia, in Ukraine. There's so much that's gone wrong with that it's going to be years to unspool it. But it's a good argument for civilian control. And then how do you want to break up your branches? What sort of activities do you want your military to be able to do? Right? An army is good at fighting on land. How necessary is a large army going to be for a place like Mars? If you have it as a single political unit, do you need as much of an army? Air Force. Well, it's actually really hard to fly on Mars because there's not enough air. So maybe a Space Force. Ooh, control the airspace. Martian Navy. Do we need a Navy? We need a Space Navy. The model for space is Navy, not Air Force, and I'm sticking to that because who wants to be a general of the fleet? No, you are the admiral of the fleet. They are spaceships. They are not space planes. I have feelings about this. Even though I'm from the lineage of Air Force and Army people, space is the Navy. Damn it. Do you want a military that's able to force project deeply, or do you want a military that's really good at turtling up? Do you want a military that is capable of long-range attack, or do you want a military that's good at doing a lot of boots-on-the-ground stuff? When you are thinking about funding and building your branches and the things that you prioritize in building your military, the things you spend money on, right? There is a limited amount of resources you can spend. Okay? So what are you going to end up spending it on? Just for an example, Russia spends a lot of money on artillery. They don't spend a lot of money on troops. Why would you want to spend a lot of money on artillery if you are a quasi-dictator? Because it takes troops to overthrow and do a coup. It's hard to do a coup with artillery. And then there's a lot of other stupid decisions that go on there, right? On the other hand, right, do you want to have a good Air Force or do you want to have a good Navy? Well, we don't need to have that discussion with Mars because you probably focus most heavily on a Space Force. And then maybe you can do some force projected things. We'll talk more about that next Monday. So how do you control these flows of money? Who's in charge of making those decisions? Do you want the executive to be in charge? The more power and authority you give to an executive over a military, the easier that is to become a dictator, right? But at the same time, if you give more power to the legislature to control the military, they'll be arguing and debating for months while there are troops on the ground. So there's benefits and drawbacks, again, of all of these choices. So ultimately, all of these institutions we've been talking about need force in some way to back them up. They need force. They need money because they need money to be able to buy the things to project force. And then you have to figure out how you're going to wield them and who's going to run the institutions and how the institutions are going to relate to each other to make the apparatus of a state work. This might be the most orbital view of how a government functions you've ever come across. Because we've been having to think in a very meta way about how the institutions of a state work. Right? So I hope you're able to get some value from this so that we can go on Wednesday and talk about, well, what are the on-the-ground politics going to be, right? What are the big political fights we can see happening within Mars, right? So within the politics of Mars. Internally, what are the problems going to be? And then next week, next Monday, we're going to do just a crash course on space geopolitics. Well, astropolitics. We're going to call it astropolitics. So relations between essentially Earth and Mars from a military perspective. Space war. Get there. Questions? Comments? Concerns?
So next Wednesday, our papers are due presenting that.
Next Wednesday, you're presenting your papers. They're not due. They're not going to be due. All right, first time doing this. It's a very common thing in academia, especially among those of us before the paper's finished and done and ready to be turned in. You actually want to present it first and get feedback from everybody about the things you could do better, do worse, right? So I'm going to give you each at most 6 of y'all. So I'll give y'all each 10 minutes just to present your argument, the problem you found, right? Present the paper. But it doesn't have to be done, right? So with your detailed outline, you probably have enough to go on. And that's the point where we're going to check each other's work. If we have any time left over, I'll do mine as well. We got one ready to roll. So that's what we'll do, right? It's good to present first, so that then it makes your paper stronger when you go to turn it in. We're all right. The thing that is due that Wednesday is the Constitution. That's what I do want that day is the Constitution. So watch out, right? We've basically been over what it is, but I just want a quick précis of how y'all set it up.
So when is the actual paper?
The paper itself, the finalist version of the paper, the one you want me to throw a grade on. May. I think I have it set for the 10th.
Okay.
That'll give you all a little over a week to get it done from the time you got the feedback. So if that's pretty fair.
Is it okay if my page count isn't 10 to 12?
Or higher or lower?
Lower.
How much lower?
I don't know yet.
I would say the bare minimum acceptable is probably 7 or 8, bare minimum acceptable. If you make a good, concise argument and it's all laid out, I'm more concerned about the argument itself. But the level of complexity I'm expecting from y'all on this, I think 7 double space is about as bottom as you can go on it.
Okay.
The 10 to 12 is aspirational. I was kind of giving y'all a little bit more range there, but 7 to 8, that's about the minimum viable that I think this paper can be.
Okay.
That's about how long the other ones of these I've written have been. But they bounce between the 7 or 8 range, and I got one that's 15 to 20, somewhere around there. So, yeah.
Alright, that's all I got.
We're panicking. Don't panic about this class. It'll be fine in this class. All right, then I will see you all on Wednesday. Have a good day, and let's finish strong.